comes back and it makes it worse. And so, for our understanding, we're trying to ask you guys questions in order to get a better understanding of PTSD and like how to cure it. And our first question is, in our current text, we see a character who suffers from untreated PTSD. He drinks heavily as well participates in illegal drugs to cope with what he was going through. Is it typical to respond? Is that a typical way to respond, and how could you help him if you're a real person?
There are multiple ways people respond to the challenges that they face. Go through combat, and the experiences you see are not necessarily going to mesh with your worldview when you first get there. And so, how do you wrestle with that? How do you process it? Then you add upon return home, setting PTSD aside, you've got reintegration issues, because they tell you when you leave, the world will go on without you. And although you hear that and it sinks in, you really don't believe it till you get back. And then you get back, and the world did go on without you. Your family had fun while you were away. And that's difficult to process in yourself. Some do look towards some type of medicating process to soothe the trauma that they have. Some find other avenues. They escalated the risk behaviors, such as motorcycles, big deal, going rock climbing, something that can appease that emotional challenge that they're having. And when you're in combat, your emotions, your adrenaline is at a phenomenal level. So you got that going on when you come back. So here you have a body that's operating at a tempo that's phenomenally high. You come back, and life is a lot slower back home. And so, as a character in your situation, he's not only dealing with the psychological challenge of PTSD, he's also dealing with reintegration. He's dealing with this physiological change that has happened and trying to find some way to balance all that out. Some people look towards those avenues of drugs and alcohol. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Drugs and alcohol are a pretty common way of coping. They're an ineffective way of coping because they cause lots of problems later, but they're very common because they're easy, right? It feels good for a little bit to take drugs and alcohol, so it kind of just numbs them to the emotional pain that they feel instead of dealing with that emotional pain, which is what we want them to do.
And not everybody comes home with PTSD. Some come with a traumatic growth. And for me, for instance, I ensured that I found those people that I could talk to early on and begin to work through some of the processing of all the dynamics that I went through. And so finding those avenues to talk with somebody you trust is a valid avenue to help alleviate that. Because alcohol, it may soothe the situation for the moment, but as he had already stated, sometimes it exacerbates your problems, makes things so much worse. You'd asked, how is it that you guide somebody to address these issues? And finding those people that will talk and listen without judgment. And if you hear what's going on and they may share without having the, can't believe you did that kind of reaction, and just listen, it really makes an impact. Because we really desire somebody to know our story, but we're very fearful that you will judge us for the comments that we make.
All right, next question. With the label of having PTSD, what can you not do that an ordinary person can do?
With a label.
So like in our text, it said, so he has PTSD, and so it kind of limits him like for what jobs he can do and what things he can do as a person.
It really depends upon the severity of the situation. For instance, one of the challenges I have is going to 4th of July. You go to 4th of July, oftentimes I'll do very well through it, but certain times there's a sequence that happens that really, all of a sudden I feel my blood pressure rise, my temperature's rising. I have got to get out of the area. This last year, it's been quite a while since I've been in combat. I thought it should be an issue this year. I'm in the back of a vehicle, back of a van, and we're pulling in the parking lot, and all of a sudden I have a panic attack. I have got to get out of this vehicle now. And my daughter hops out of the the front driver's seat goes to the back, pops the back door, and I climb over the seat and get out. Things were cool then. So it really depends upon the severity of what we're talking about, because I live a normal functional life. And those kind of issues don't hinder me. They have times where I recognize the physiological changes and I'm able to address them when they happen. Whereas some may get to a point where they're incapacitated, getting to a point where they can't function well because it is so enamored within their mind. So it really just depends on the individual. There is no one size fits all situation. Do you concur?
Oh, right. It sounds like the character in your book has severe PTSD. So what Chaplain Foster was explaining is, so our brains are designed to, have you heard the fight or flight before? Have you heard that phrase, fight or flight? So we're designed, so a caveman meets a giant saber-toothed tiger, and his brain is designed to release hormones that cause them to either freeze up and act dead or fly and run. So in combat, the fight or flight syndrome is constantly being accessed. So a soldier's body is constantly receiving these hormones that tell them to either fight or fly. So what happens is when they return home, as in what Chaplain said, is when he went to the 4th of July, his body remembered that constant fight or flight and release of hormones at that moment when he heard those sounds of the fireworks. And that sound was a trigger for him because it reminded him of the war. So immediately his body released a lot of hormones that caused him to, in his case, fight and fly at the same time. He got out of the vehicle. So it sounds like your character suffers from that constant release of hormones, and he's fighting and flying at every little sound or trigger. It would make it very hard for him to have a job where he's in a large group of people, or where there's lots of noise. So it'd be very difficult for him because his brain is still producing hormones that our brains aren't producing that right now. But I guarantee if I put a tiger in here, what would you do? You'd run, right? Because your brain would produce all those hormones. So for a combat vet, like the character in your story, it's like there's a tiger in the room all the time, if that makes sense.
All right, what's the next question?
Hunter? What are noticeable signs that people can see of PTSD?
For most people, you wouldn't know it at all. You would have no clue. I can carry on a conversation, look like everybody else, and people I know the same way. You just wouldn't know. Now, there are those who, if they continue down a path of alcohol and drugs, the body will be affected by that stimulus hitting the system. And then you have the typical challenges that arise from anybody who has those type of situations. But I don't know, for those people that I know who have it, you would never know it. They look and act like everybody else does. Now, what you'll find is, oftentimes, because of our experience, we will become more recluse. You watch them go into a McDonald's, see where they sit. They will sit to make sure their back is not towards the glass window. Is that PTSD, or is that from the trained experience of always making sure that your perimeter is protected? You make the decision. But you'll see those type of actions. You'll see that in a police officer. You can sit in the room and look and see who the police officers are in the room. You can see who the soldiers are in the room because of their experiences training them that I need to act, respond, and never be off. Sleeping, my kids don't wake me up unless they're far away because they're concerned with my reaction. And so they'll wake me up from a distance. Went on a trip a while back with a group of individuals, and I was just laying there getting ready to go to sleep, and my son told the kids that don't mess with him at night. Because sometimes when you're teenagers, we play pranks on each other. My son told them, said, "You'll be sorry you played prank on him in the middle of the night." Because where I was at in Iraq, we had bad guys sneaking into the camp trying to attack the individuals within the camp. And so, just sleeping, you had to be sort of in this quasi and not fully asleep, but constantly aware of something going on around you, and you had to be prepared. And so even in my house, if I hear sound, I'm on full alert in the middle of the night. And you begin to scan, you listen for everything, your eyes become very, very sensitive to what's going on around you. Those type of actions you'll see with those who have combat experience.
What makes a person get PTSD?
Ooh, I'll let you answer that.
Okay. Trauma, exposure to trauma. So, and usually PTSD doesn't happen by, it doesn't happen by a singular trauma event. So if you see something bad happen just once, you're less likely to get PTSD. PTSD happens when you've experienced trauma over a period of time. So it makes sense that a veteran who's been in a war zone where trauma happens day after day after day may develop PTSD. But the primary, really the only way I know to get PTSD is to experience trauma, whether physically or emotionally. So not just veterans, but also those who've been violently abused, or occasionally someone who's been in a terrible accident. But again, your body responds to trauma with that fight or flight, and all those hormones are released into your body. And so over time, as that continues to happen, whether it's a soldier or someone who's been traumatically abused over time, your brain changes and it continues to release those hormones, and that causes PTSD. So what the chaplain was talking about, that's called hypervigilance, when someone's on guard all the time, they're watching doors, or they don't like to be woken up, because the hypervigilance has happened so much that it's become ingrained in them. So, but the primary way to get PTSD is to experience trauma, and typically more than once.
What does the Army do, like, help people with, like, therapy with PTSD? Like, do they, like, put them in a special program, or like medicine, like, what do they do to help that?
A little bit of all of that.
Yeah, all of that.
Equine therapy is really, I know University of Michigan put out a report 2013 that said those who get involved within the outdoors type activities, such as being with horses. I know someone here just recently this week had a severe case, and they've given him a service dog. And working with the animals helps them slow down and process better. And you see some of the signs of PTSD lower because of those activities with animals. Counseling is a big emphasis. Creating a climate where counseling is a part of it. We've had commanders, after a particular combat experience, will send everybody to the counselors. Lottie-dottie, everybody. Whether you feel you got an issue or not, we want to create a culture where everybody goes, they have the opportunity to talk, to download and process what they experienced, so they're able to function better later on. And so we've implemented different avenues such as that.
And drugs as well. There are drugs that you can be prescribed, but they don't cure it. They just alleviate some of the symptoms.
So like maybe like takes your mind off of it, or what would that feel like?
Yeah, it inhibits some of those hormones that we talked about. It inhibits them from causing as much stress. I don't want to get, like, cortisol is a hormone that gets released, so it inhibits cortisol production. Therapy and acceptance and some drug therapies together really works well. There's no cure for PTSD. You'll never be cured, but you can alleviate it a great deal to where you're highly functional.
And you learn what a new normal is. And that's the biggest challenge, is what you experienced and how you lived life before and what it is now. It's different. And you can compare it to the fact when you're little and you get Christmas or some kind of activity that happens, you get a little older, it just seems different. It's a new normal because of your age and your experiences have changed, what you experienced as a little kid. Well, going to combat and coming back, you have to learn this new normal, and how is it that you function with these challenges within your life. You can make it, and you can have a very productive life, but it's learning to moderate it. You'll see a lot of folks have outbursts of anger, how is it that you find what those triggers are to elicit that severe